I'm Rachel Donovan, 30 years old, and for most of my life, I thought love meant giving until you had nothing left. I grew up in a house where my brother's mistakes were brushed aside, and my sacrifices were treated like chores. Every dollar I earned as a teenager went into paying bills or covering debts that weren't mine. Yet I believed one day my parents would finally see me as the daughter who kept us from falling apart. That illusion carried me into adulthood, where I worked harder, gave more, and quietly disappeared into the background of my own family. By the time I planned my father's 60th birthday, I was convinced the right gesture could heal years of neglect, never realizing how wrong I was. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've ever carried more than your share just to keep a family together. I was raised in Hartford, Connecticut, the older child of a family that always seemed one step away from breaking. When my father lost his job at the factory, I was 12 years old enough to understand that food and heat weren't guaranteed. My mother spent her energy defending Adam, saying he had big dreams that needed room to grow while I picked up babysitting shifts and delivered newspapers before school. I used every dollar I earned to keep the lights on, thinking responsibility was just part of being the good child. By the time I was 16, my hands were cracked from folding papers, and my stomach often ached from skipped meals, but I believed I was doing the right thing. Adam lived in a different world under the same roof. 3 years older, he was given cash whenever he asked whether it was for new sneakers or late-night card games. I once discovered a letter demanding repayment for a $5,000 gambling debt. I emptied my savings to pay it, imagining that act would protect us from collapse, but all it did was reinforce his safety net. My mother praised his charm and called his mistakes phases, while my father sat quietly in front of the television, never once asking him to change. Every effort I made dissolved like water into sand, unnoticed and unacknowledged. I held on to the hope that my loyalty would be seen eventually. Christmases where I worked double shifts to buy thoughtful gifts ended with my mother gushing over Adam's handwritten card. Nights when I balanced the checkbook to stretch the last of the money, I overheard her telling neighbors that Adam was destined to succeed. Even as I entered Syracuse University, juggling 3 jobs to pay tuition and send money home, I convinced myself that someday they would realize who had truly kept them afloat. I wanted more than a degree. I wanted proof that my sacrifices meant something. But with every semester came another call, another bill, another of Adam's broken promises that somehow became my responsibility. I sold belongings, skipped meals, and drained student loans to cover medical treatments for my father and debts Adam never owned up to. I thought love was a debt I had to pay in advance, as if one day I would collect it in return. What I didn't see then was that the account was empty no matter how much I poured into it. I kept believing, though. Believing that the right gift, the right gesture would finally open their eyes. That faith led me to plan my father's milestone birthday, an event I hoped would change everything. What I didn't know was that it would also break the last thread holding me to them. The Maplewood was one of the nicest restaurants in Hartford, the kind of place with dim lights, polished wood tables, and servers who made you feel like every dish was the most important of the evening. I had spent weeks arranging my father's 60th birthday there, calling vendors on my lunch break, and checking details late into the night. I wanted every part of it to be perfect, from the custom cake with blue lettering to the salmon and roasted potatoes I knew he loved. I told myself it would be the one night when all my years of effort finally counted for something. That evening, I arrived early in a navy dress I had saved for special occasions. I smoothed the fabric as I checked the private dining room one last time. The flowers were in place, the wine was ready, and the cake was waiting in the kitchen. I felt my stomach tighten with both nerves and hope as the rest of my family began to arrive. My father walked in slowly, his shoulders thinner than I remembered, and gave me a small smile before sitting down. My mother followed, scrolling through her phone, even as she took her seat. Adam came in last, leaning back in his chair with the same careless grin he always wore. When the table settled, I raised my glass. My voice was steady as I spoke about wanting to celebrate our father to give him something more than a meal. I slid an envelope across the table, explaining that inside were tickets for him and my mother to spend a week in Hawaii, all expenses paid. I had saved for months to make it happen, picturing their faces lighting up when they realized what I had done. Instead, Adam let out a sharp laugh and clinked his glass against the table. The best gift, he said, his voice loud enough for every relative to hear, is you leaving forever. His words hit the room like a stone through glass. My mother didn't scold him. She didn't even look surprised. She simply smirked, her eyes flashing with something cold as if she agreed with him. My father kept his gaze on his plate, not saying a word. Around us, a few cousins shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. In that moment, years of late nights, extra jobs, and sacrifices I had convinced myself were worth it replayed in my mind. I thought about every bill I had covered, every debt I had cleared, every meal I had skipped to make sure they had what they needed. And still what I received was a sneer and a silence heavy enough to crush me. I set my glass down and looked straight at Adam. My hand didn't shake, even though my chest burned. "Fine," I said quietly. "But don't come to me when you need something." His grin faltered. My mother's smirk slipped away. My father kept staring at the table, frozen in place. I turned to the waiter, handed him my card, and told him to split the bill evenly. No more covering the cost, no more pretending it was my duty to make up for everyone else's carelessness. I gathered my coat and walked out, the sound of my heels echoing across the tile like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The night air was cool when I stepped outside, carrying a stillness that the dining room hadn't offered me. I gripped my keys and kept walking until I reached my car, each step heavier than the last, but also freer somehow. When I slid into the driver's seat, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't bargaining with myself that the next gesture would finally matter. The drive back through Hartford was quiet streetlights glowing on empty sidewalks as I thought about what had just unfolded. The Hawaii trip I had saved so carefully for felt meaningless now, nothing more than proof of how blind I had been. Adam's voice echoed in my ears, but it no longer cut into me the way it had inside that room. It sounded different now, like a door closing. Back at my apartment, I set my purse down and sat at the edge of the couch, staring into the stillness around me. My phone buzzed once then again, with their numbers lighting up the screen. I didn't answer. Not that night. The silence was mine, and I wasn't ready to give it up. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Within days, the calls would multiply, the messages would grow desperate, and the weight I had carried alone for years would try to settle back onto my shoulders. But that night, as the glow from the restaurant faded in my memory, I realized something had shifted. The illusion that my loyalty could ever earn their love was gone. The night after the party, I hardly slept. I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, while their voices replayed in my head. Adam's words cut deep, but what stayed with me even more was my mother's smirk and my father's silence. I had spent years convincing myself that love would come if I just gave enough. That illusion had cracked wide open at the dinner table, and now there was nothing to hide behind. 2 days later, the calls started. My phone buzzed with Elaine's number again and again. When I finally picked up, her tone was urgent. She said the hospital had demanded another $12,000 for my father's treatment. I listened until she paused, then said only one sentence. "It's been 48 hours, and you've already forgotten what I told you." She tried to speak again, but I ended the call and blocked her number. Not long after Adam's messages came through, he begged for $3,000 to clear a gambling debt, promising it would be the last time. I didn't reply. When the calls turned into threats from unknown numbers, I blocked those too. Then my father left a voicemail, his voice hoarse, saying they needed me. I deleted it without listening to the rest. For the first time, I wasn't reaching for my purse. I wasn't stretching another paycheck to cover what they refused to face. The letters arrived next. One envelope bore my mother's handwriting lines about memories from when I was a child. She mentioned baking cookies together when I was 10, slipping that detail in between descriptions of bills they couldn't pay. My hands shook as I tore it in half. I knew the words were meant to soften me, to remind me of the girl who once believed she could fix everything, but I wasn't that girl anymore. At work, I tried to bury myself in numbers and deadlines. My firm had just lost a major client, and the responsibility to rebuild the pitch fell on my team. My boss asked me to lead the revision for the upcoming conference in Chicago, knowing the stakes were high. I stayed late most nights, poring over spreadsheets and slides until my eyes blurred. Mark often stayed too, helping me adjust forecasts and tighten margins. One evening, as we pushed through the last calculations, he looked at me and said quietly, "You've got this." It wasn't encouragement I had asked for, but the certainty in his voice steadied me. Even after hours of work, I found myself restless at night. That was when I began writing. At first, it was only a few lines on a notepad, fragments about a woman breaking chains she had carried for too long. Soon the words filled pages. I signed up for a writing workshop at the community center, not sure what to expect. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Lena, read one of my pieces and told me, "You have a voice." Hearing that startled me. It wasn't flattery, it was recognition. The workshop became a quiet refuge. Once a week, I sat in a circle with strangers who listened as I read stories shaped from my own exhaustion and release. They nodded, some even clapped, but I realized I didn't need their approval. It was enough to put the words down to create something for myself. It was the first time in years I wasn't writing checks for someone else's mistakes, but building something I owned. The calls didn't stop. Some came from withheld numbers, others from local lines I didn't recognize. Each voicemail carried the same rhythm, pleading, accusing, insisting. I deleted them all. When guilt crept in, I went for early morning runs through quiet Hartford streets. The rhythm of my steps cleared my head. Each mile reminded me that I was still standing, even without them. The conference loomed closer, and I poured every ounce of energy into preparing. Mark and I rebuilt the client proposal, rewriting forecasts, and designing slides that could withstand tough questions. We shared takeout meals in the office at 2 a.m, laughing at how punch-drunk the exhaustion made us. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of confidence that had nothing to do with whether I answered my family's calls. One night after class, Lena asked me why I started writing. I told her it began as a way to quiet the noise of unanswered voicemails. She nodded and said, "Then keep writing. Don't stop now." Her words lingered. They weren't demands or obligations, they were a doorway. I knew the next storm wasn't far. My mother's letters were growing more desperate, my brother's debts heavier, my father's health still fragile. But for once, their urgency didn't dictate my choices. I was beginning to see a life where my worth wasn't tied to the weight I could carry. And as the conference drew near, I sensed that moment would force me to choose whether to step back into their chaos or continue forward into a future that was finally mine. The conference arrived after weeks of preparation. I boarded the early train to Chicago with my briefcase balanced on my lap, rehearsing figures in my head while the landscape blurred past the window. When I checked into the hotel, my phone lit up with another call from a withheld number. I silenced it without hesitation, focusing on the task in front of me. For once, I was here for myself, not answering someone else's demands. The ballroom where the presentations were held was filled with rows of chairs screens, glowing with graphs and projections. Our team was scheduled midway through the morning. Mark leaned over as we waited to be introduced and said, "We've covered every angle. Just speak the way you do in the office." His calm tone steadied me. When I stepped to the podium, the lights overhead made the room feel hot, but I focused on the slides we had polished night after night. Words flowed numbers aligned, and when the clients asked questions, I had the answers ready. When it ended, polite applause rippled across the room, and I felt a quiet strength settle inside me. Back in Hartford, my family's chaos continued to press against the edges of my life. Another envelope arrived at my apartment, this one heavier than the last, filled with copies of medical bills, and a handwritten note from my mother. She wrote that my father's health was worsening, that Adam had lost another job, that they had no way forward without me. I set it aside unopened for hours before finally skimming the words. Instead of guilt, a new thought came to me. I had already done enough. That realization grew in the days that followed. I kept attending the writing workshop each week, reading pieces aloud that traced the outline of my own journey. One evening after I finished, Lena looked around the room and then back at me. "You're writing about release," she said. "Do you see that?" I nodded slowly. It was true. The stories no longer carried the weight of desperation, they carried the beginnings of freedom. At work, the aftermath of the conference brought results. Our firm landed the client we had been fighting to keep. My manager called me into his office and thanked me for leading the team through a difficult stretch. It wasn't grand recognition, but it was earned. Walking back to my desk, I felt lighter than I had in years. The calls from blocked numbers still came. I deleted the voicemails without listening. Each time the act felt less like running and more like standing firm. One night, sitting in my living room with a glass of water in hand, I thought about how many years I had spent rushing to answer every ring, believing that family came before myself. Now I could sit in silence and feel no compulsion to respond. I began to notice other small shifts. My mornings started with runs through the park, not with checking my bank account for what I could send home. My evenings were filled with drafts of new stories or brushstrokes of paint across a canvas, not the endless calculations of which debt to cover next. Each routine that belonged only to me was a reminder of the life I was reclaiming. The change wasn't sudden, it was steady, like a door opening a little wider each day. When Mark suggested we celebrate the client win with dinner, I said yes without hesitation. We sat at a quiet restaurant downtown, talking about everything but work. For the first time, I didn't feel the shadow of a buzzing phone or the weight of unspoken obligations pressing down on me. But even as I stepped further into this new rhythm, I knew the past wasn't finished with me. Elaine's letters grew more insistent, Adam's debts more reckless, and my father's silence more haunting. The break I had made at the party had changed me, but their hold hadn't fully disappeared. Each step forward carried the knowledge that they would keep reaching testing whether I would return to the role I had once played so completely. And soon one message would force me to face that choice again, pressing me to decide if the chains I had broken could ever be reforged. A week after the conference, I received a voicemail from Carol Peters. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, just said she thought I should know that Adam had been fired from his job at the dealership. Missed too many shifts, apparently. She added that Elaine had started pawning jewelry to pay off a few things, and that the phones had been shut off. "It's bad over there, Rachel," she said before hanging up. I listened to the message twice, not out of doubt, but because something in Carol's voice felt different this time. There was no guilt laced into her words, no effort to sway me, just facts. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone in my lap. I thought about the last 10 years, how many jobs Adam had lost, how many calls I had answered, how many balances I had drained. Then I turned the phone off and left it face down on the dresser. The next morning, Mark stopped by my desk with coffee. He had a meeting on the west side of town and invited me to join him for lunch after. I said yes without checking my calendar. We met later at a quiet cafe with a row of booths near the windows. Over sandwiches and iced tea, he asked how the writing class was going. I told him I'd submitted a short piece for review, one that had taken me 2 weeks to write. He smiled and said, "You've been building something whether you realize it or not." On the way back, I passed a pawn shop near Union Street. The front display was cluttered with watches, tools, and a few tarnished rings. It wasn't hard to imagine Elaine walking in there with her wedding band clenched in her hand. For a moment I stood still in front of the window. Then I turned and kept walking. That weekend I visited the local art center where I had enrolled in a painting class. The instructor, a man named Paul, showed us how to blend color with broad strokes. My canvas was quiet at first, just layers of blue and gray, but the longer I worked, the more it started to resemble a storm breaking open. When Paul came by, he nodded once and said, "That's movement. Let it keep going." I left the studio with paint on my hands and a sense of forward motion I hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, another letter came. It was from Elaine, written in the same careful script she always used when she wanted something. She said Dad's medications had been delayed, that they needed to move him to a smaller apartment, and that Adam was trying his best. At the bottom of the page was a simple ask to borrow $500. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer where the others had gone. The next morning, I dropped a check into the mail, but it wasn't made out to my mother. It was for the regional art show application fee. I had decided to submit one of my pieces, a swirl of deep green and burnt gold that felt like breath held too long. I didn't know if it would be accepted, but the act of sending it felt like reclaiming space that had never belonged to me. At work, the pace picked up. I was asked to review 2 new accounts and help onboard a junior associate. Mark and I shared late evenings again this time, reviewing investment proposals. We worked quietly, trading comments and quiet jokes. One night after wrapping up a particularly long call with a new client, he said, "You've changed, you know. Not in a bad way, just steadier." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure I needed to. The following week, I passed by Carol on my walk home. She was outside tending to her hedges. She waved me over and mentioned that Elaine had asked her to call. "She says it's urgent." Carol added, brushing dirt off her gloves. I thanked her and kept walking. My hands were steady at my sides. That night the phone rang again, no caller ID, just the familiar rhythm of persistence. I let it ring. Then I sat down and started outlining a new story, one about a woman who chose not to answer the door. Her name wasn't mine, but her silence felt familiar. I could feel something shifting. Not loudly, not all at once. Just the first quiet act of resistance that didn't ask permission. It was a Wednesday when Mark sent me the screenshot. I was at my desk finishing quarterly projections when his message popped up. "You need to see this," it read. Below it was a link to a public post on a local forum, one I didn't follow. The author was Adam. The post was long and dramatic, written like a plea for sympathy. In it, Adam claimed I had abandoned our dying father and stolen family savings to fund my lifestyle. He used my full name, Rachel Donovan, and even included a photo from years ago, cropped from a family gathering where I was smiling with a plate of food in my hands. "She left us to rot," he wrote, took what she wanted, and walked away. I stared at the screen for several minutes, not moving. Dozens of strangers had already commented, some calling me selfish, others offering to start a fundraiser for him. The words didn't sting because they were true. They stung because he knew they weren't, and he didn't care. I didn't respond. I didn't post a rebuttal or explain the $70,000 I'd spent over the years or the nights I sat in emergency rooms on hold with billing departments. I clicked report, then blocked his profile. That was all. A few days later, I met Carol at the diner near the library. She slid into the booth with tired eyes and didn't waste time. "Adam's out of money. Owes $8,000 to someone he can't name. Your mom's been selling what she can, pawned her ring, her kitchen mixer, even some old furniture. They're saying it's your fault." I stirred the cream into my coffee and listened. Carol didn't sound accusatory, just tired. "They say you turned your back on them," she added. I looked out the window. "They had my back for years," I said quietly, "but only to push me forward when they needed something." She nodded. I figured as much. At the office, I kept my head down and worked. The conference win had positioned us well with new clients, and I was assigned to lead the onboarding of 2 more. My boss dropped by one afternoon with news about a promotion team lead. It came with more responsibility, a slight raise and a corner desk with a view of the river. I accepted without hesitation. In the evenings I returned to the studio. Painting had become less about expression and more about recovery. My latest canvas was a stretch of deep red layered with shades of ash and rust. Paul said it looked like a threshold, like something was either ending or just beginning. A few weeks later, I got a message from Melissa, an old friend from high school who still lived near my parents. She asked if we could meet. We met at a small park, sitting on a bench near the duck pond. Melissa didn't soften her words. Your parents sold the house, couldn't keep up with the medical bills. Your dad's in a one-bedroom apartment now, barely enough space for his equipment. Your mom's working part-time cleaning houses. She paused before continuing. Adam's couch surfing. Says he's got a plan, but no one believes it. I took a slow breath. They'll figure it out. Melissa studied me. You sound different. I looked over at the pond. I guess I am. The following week, I reviewed our team's quarterly numbers and finalized a presentation for the executive board. The room was filled with department heads and clients I used to feel small in front of. But that day, I stood at the front of the room with my charts and summaries, answering every question clearly. When the meeting ended, one client shook my hand and said, "That was the cleanest strategy we've seen this year." After work, I stopped by the frame shop near the studio and picked up the final mounting for my painting. The exhibition was approaching, and Paul had encouraged me to submit something new. I brought the canvas home and hung it in my apartment for a few days just to sit with it. It wasn't bold or flashy, but it felt true. I titled it, Let Go. Their world was unraveling without me. For years, I had thought that if I left, everything would fall apart, and now it had. But I wasn't the one who broke it, and for the first time, I wasn't racing to fix it. The promotion changed my schedule. I was now leading a team of 5 managing portfolios that stretched into 7 figures. My office faced the river, and I often kept the blinds open late into the evening, letting the city lights filter in while I worked. There was still pressure, plenty of it, but the kind I chose to carry. One afternoon, after wrapping up a call with a new client, I opened a separate account at the credit union down the street. This one was just for me. The transfers I used to send to Elaine every month were now going towards something real, something mine. A future I could live inside of, not survive through. I started looking at neighborhoods with old houses that needed work properties with fenced-in yards and wide porches. At the same time, I kept painting. My evenings were spent layering color across canvas, moving from loose abstracts to detailed portraits. The studio became a second home. My latest piece was a self-portrait. Green eyes, sharp lips, steady hair loose across one shoulder. Paul stopped behind me one evening and said, "That looks like someone who stopped asking permission." He suggested I submit it to a regional exhibition. I filled out the form without hesitation and titled the piece Inheritance. It wasn't about money or property, it was about what I'd chosen to carry forward and what I'd left behind. Around that same time, Mark and I started meeting outside of work more often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a walk. We talked about little things, his weekend hikes, my upcoming art show, his growing interest in restoring old bikes. It was easy and steady. Not once did he treat me like I needed to be rescued, just respected. One Saturday morning, Melissa texted again. We met outside the grocery store, leaning against her car with coffees in hand. "Your mom's working 3 part-time jobs now," she said. "Housekeeping, some catering, and a temp job at the hospital. Your dad's still sick and they can't afford all his medication. Adam's been staying with a friend, but rumor is he's burned through that bridge too." She paused, then added, "They're still blaming you." I nodded. I figured. Melissa watched me for a moment. "You're not going to help, are you, no?" She didn't push, just reached out and squeezed my hand before saying goodbye. Later that week, I walked into the community center for the art show's opening night. The walls were lined with work from all over the state landscapes, sculptures, oil portraits, and digital collages. My painting hung near the end of the east hallway, a small spotlight casting a soft glow across the frame. A couple stood in front of it when I arrived. The woman tilted her head and said, "There's something in the eyes, like she's been through fire," and kept walking. I didn't introduce myself. I just stood a few steps back and let the words settle. A short while later, someone placed a red sticker on the tag below the frame. Sold. $200. Not a fortune. But it felt like a marker, like something I had built with my own hands had value. Mark met me at the entrance afterward, smiling as I stepped outside. "You did it," he said. We walked in silence for a block before I spoke. They always told me I was selfish for wanting more than what they needed from me. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back at the office, I reviewed new investment leads, signed off on a hiring plan, and scheduled strategy meetings for the quarter ahead. Each task was steady, each goal clear. There were no emergencies, no frantic calls, no quiet demands dragging at the edges of my focus. Melissa sent one last message later that month. Just a sentence. "Adam's gone. No one knows where." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. And in that silence for the first time, I felt what it meant to win, not in money, not in applause, but in peace. A year after that night at the Maplewood, I stood in the middle of my own home, a fixer-upper just outside Hartford, with peeling paint, creaky floors, and a front porch wide enough for a rocking chair. I'd saved every month since the promotion cut corners where I could, and finally signed the deed 2 weeks before my 31st birthday. The day I moved in, I unpacked slowly, setting each item down with care. No one called to ask for money. No one asked where I'd gone. The house needed work, still does, but every loose floorboard and faded window belongs to me. In the hallway, I hung a small painting from that first community art show. It's not the one that sold. This one never left my wall, a canvas streaked with greens and deep golds, shaped into a figure looking over her shoulder with nothing holding her back. At work, things stayed steady. I led quarterly planning for the new fiscal year, trained 2 junior analysts, and helped land a regional bank as a long-term client. My boss started including me in leadership meetings, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was just doing what I was built to do. Mark and I still meet for coffee on Saturday mornings. Sometimes we walk afterwards, sometimes we don't. He listens more than he talks, which suits me fine. There's something about being around someone who expects nothing from you but honesty. It makes space for the rest to grow naturally. I haven't heard from Adam in months. The last update came through Melissa, who said he'd left town, owed money in too many places. Elaine never wrote again. The letters stopped after I returned the final one unopened. Carol mentioned that Charles had stabilized, though the apartment remained too small and the debts too large. But even that update came without expectation. Just information passed along and left there. Sometimes I think about all the nights I stayed up calculating what I could send, or all the years I thought love meant disappearing to make others comfortable. It's a strange kind of grief, realizing you were never seen the way you saw them, but it's also freedom. I still write. Not always for workshops, sometimes just for myself late at night with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a cup of tea cooling nearby. The stories have changed. They're not about rescue anymore. They're about rebuilding, quietly, deliberately, piece by piece. I thought walking away from my family would feel like failure. It didn't. It felt like stepping into a room I didn't realize was mine to enter. I didn't slam the door behind me. I just closed it gently and kept walking. If you're listening to this and you've ever carried more than your share, if you've ever been asked to shrink so someone else could shine, I hope you know this. You don't need anyone's permission to become whole. Thanks for being here with me. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're building something for yourself, I hope you keep going. You deserve it.